All right, so welcome to this webinar. We're excited that you're all here. My name is Dr. Alicia Shadaman. I'm the Director of Nonprofit and NGO Studies here at NIU. I've been here since 2010. I probably know many of you on the call. I'm excited today because we have two just incredible people to lead us in this webinar, at least this webinar discussion. This has been going on for a while now. We've been doing these webinars since COVID started, but even after, we've been keeping them going. Every month on the second Tuesday of the month, we have this conversation. And it really is a conversation about particular issues or topics that we think are important in the public. And so this month is on transforming neighborhoods. So I'll introduce our speakers and then we'll get right to it because we only have an hour. So totally understand if you need to eat your lunch, you can keep your camera off and on, whatever you'd like, whatever you're comfortable with. So Dr. Nathaniel Wright is an assistant professor of political science and directed their Master of Public Administration, but he was also recently named Assistant Dean of Strategic Initiatives for the College of Arts and Sciences at Texas Tech University. He received his BA and Master's in Public Administration from Binghamton University and a PhD in Public Administration from the University of Kansas. Among his research interests, and he has several, but he really does research the role that social advocacy organizations play in sustainable neighborhoods. So I thought he'd be a great person to join our other speaker today. So he's an expert in community relations and engagement, something that he has in common also with Jennifer Groce, our other participant today. So Jennifer is the Director of Community Promotions for Northern Illinois University in the Division of Outreach, Engagement, and Regional Development. Much of her career has been focused on community and economic development, including her previous roles as Executive Director of Renew Dekalb and Research Associate for NIU's Center for Governmental Studies. She served and continues to serve on a number of organizations. I didn't even write them all down, Jen, because there's too many, all related to her passion for this community. She's a double Husky, receiving her undergraduate degree in political science and master's degree in public administration. And she's currently working on a doctorate in education. So I guess she'll be a triple Husky at that point. So welcome you both, and I'm excited to start this conversation today.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hey,
so we had a chat before last week to kind of tee up the conversation. And maybe what I'll kind of start out with is, what do we mean by neighborhood transformations, neighborhood revitalization? There's a lot of lingo around there. And I think it's important to kind of frame our discussion a little bit today. What are we talking about when we refer to those words? So Nate, do you want to kick us off?
I can. Thank you so much, Alicia. And so simply put it, transforming neighborhoods or communities really focuses on improving conditions in some of the most distressed neighborhoods, but really with the emphasis on helping people that live there. It's an innovative approach that's been launched by many local governments, municipalities across the country. They're really targeted approaches, right? That not only focus on just housing, but rehabilitating housing or creating affordable housing, which is, I think, how we traditionally think about transforming neighborhoods. But a lot of municipalities and local governments across the country have really been focusing more so on issues related to crime, right? Creating jobs, also connecting residents with job opportunities. Limited access to healthcare has also been a part of the transforming neighborhoods framework, and also focusing on improving schools that have been performing low. Also, a lot of transforming neighborhood initiatives across the country also focus on reducing childhood poverty, realizing that childhood poverty really is like the #1 economic indicator, right, for growth for many cities across our country. And so essentially, transforming neighborhoods is really kind of a catch-all for everything that really impacts communities, ranging again from like healthcare, childcare, affordable housing, access to quality jobs. Transportation also is also something that we often talk about when we mean transforming neighborhoods, and also keeping in mind that many communities also are often food deserts, right? And so talking about transforming neighborhoods also encompasses making sure that we can connect low-income individuals, people who are living in marginalized communities, connecting them with quality fruits and vegetables. So that is what I guess what I mean. At least how I'll be framing kind of our conversation today in terms of what we mean by transforming neighborhoods.
So Jennifer, your work in transforming neighborhoods, what has that meant for us here around NIU and regionally when we think about transforming neighborhoods? How do we identify those and how do we examine those from a local perspective?
Sure. I just want to say, I think Nate laid out all of those pieces, sort of the cogs of that wheel that we really look at. Sometimes we use that overall encompassing buzzword, quality of life, right? All those components that would make up quality life: food, housing, shelter, access to medical care, access to transportation, access to work, sustainability, all of those things. And what that's meant in some of the work I've had the privilege of being involved in here around the university, both in the downtown in a central business district that included residential, as well as earlier on in the neighborhood immediately adjacent to campus. That starts with understanding what is the status quo, right? Where are we at right here and right now? Who's actually living in the neighborhood or who's living in these housing areas? What are their needs? What are the challenges that they are facing? And who are those stakeholders that are also playing an active role in that? And sometimes I like to say, like, that's what transformation is, but transformation starts, right, when you look at there's some kind of dissatisfaction, right? There's some dissatisfaction, whether it's the residents, those that live there, the internal stakeholders that are there, something is, they're seeing like, look, this isn't meeting my needs. Or externally, as Nate said, whether it's schools, law enforcement, social service partners, those folks are saying, we're not satisfied with what's happening for those folks that are living there or the quality of life that's being offered there.
So when we talk about assessment, like how do we assess neighborhoods, Nate? How do we know these are the neighborhoods we need to concentrate our efforts in?
Wow, you're like in my head.
I got you.
So I think it's really twofold, right? And I think it's important, right, for local government officials and community-based nonprofits really to be working hand in hand along with community residents to get a sense of kind of what their needs are first, right? Traditionally, like we think about neighborhoods who fit under this category to be anywhere from low to moderate income, right? But even several, even if you have several kind of communities or neighborhoods that identify, often they all have different, needs, right? So some could be higher on crime, some could be more, lack of job opportunities. Some could be, we don't have a grocery store in our neighborhood, right? And so there are a lot of various kind of indicators that local government can use outside of just quality of life to get a sense of what's going on within those neighborhoods. And so traditionally we think about per capita income, right? We think about like percentage of vacant housing is another one, right? We think about crime, right? And so also we think about kind of like, as I mentioned before, like childhood poverty or number of individuals living below the poverty line, right? Those are all indicators, right, that are essentially used by local government officials to really assess in terms of whether or not that neighborhood needs some sort of investment. But also too, something that's often left out of the conversation. I know we do a lot of quality of life surveys, but really going in and talking to the people that actually live in the community. Oftentimes, I think government officials and other key stakeholders often think they know what's best for the people that are living there. And so, for example, when I was working on a project in Kansas City, it was all about weatherization as a way to address poverty and quality of life. But when you talk to the residents, they were more concerned about, okay, how do I have quality access to healthcare? How do I ensure that I don't get shot on my way to take my kid to school, right? And so I think oftentimes we don't really incorporate the qualitative piece along with kind of some of the quantitative indicators that we traditionally use in local government nonprofits to really assess whether or not this community is worthy of investment.
And locally, Jen, how did we start to identify regionally the neighborhoods we needed to concentrate on? You were part of that initial examination of, we do have some problems, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive. What did that process look like?
So some of my colleagues, I can see their names on here from the Center for Governmental Studies. So when I was there, Nate, you hit this spot on earlier in a comment that you made about child poverty, right? And access to food. So in Dekalb, this all really got started in what we call the Annie Glidden neighborhood, right around campus, because the police department was noticing an increase in child theft over the summer months. So they were saying, like, why are we having this? Why is it happening that kids are shoplifting, and they're shoplifting food from the local gas station or the local little convenience store that was happening? And the police chief at the time kind of brought some folks together. And at that same time, that question was kind of being posed of that group. We began talking, the city and NIU was like, we're really seeing some changes in this neighborhood, but we don't really understand why or what. So we did a neighborhood assessment of the entire community. We divided up by neighborhoods as the city defined it. And then we had a ton of data variables that we layered in and then kind of combined at the neighborhood level. So it's all those things that Nate talked about, right? We looked at vacancy, we looked at school district data. So we knew by age, we knew by free and reduced lunch as a proxy for poverty. We looked at crime, personal safety threats, quality of life threats in a criminal term. I see Shelley's on here from the Housing Authority. We looked at housing choice vouchers, just numerous data points so we could see kind of what was happening. And in this one particular data, community leaders, right, city officials and some of the other stakeholders saw that this one area was just flaming red on all of those data variables in ways that you don't want to see. We saw concentration of poverty. We saw concentration of kids in poverty. And we learned from that question that the police department was asking that, hey, look, in the summer, when the kids are in school, they don't have access to free and reduced lunch meal programs. So what was happening was they were shoplifting because they were hungry. And that was something that we could, a local group reacted to immediately. But Nate's point, again, is spot on. We really needed to go in and talk to residents. And there were some researchers that started in one of the largest, second largest housing development in the state of Illinois and the largest in our community, and talking to residents, and a whole set of issues emerged immediately for quality of life within their development, access to transportation, food, all of those things was happening in this microcosm within a neighborhood that was really spanning out. And then it informed, oh my goodness, to numerous agencies, fire department, hospitals, schools. Everyone's like, I had no idea this was all what was happening. And then to Nate's point, then the residents added that really important qualitative part about living conditions and stigmatized relationships in the community, and really feeling like we don't belong here. You don't want us here.
So in our previous conversation that we had last week, now that we have a good sense of how do you identify these neighborhoods, there's a big question of trust among all of the partners, government to citizens, government to universities to nonprofits. There's all of that kind of stuff going on. So I don't know, Nate, if you have any thoughts around that. How do you work with a really diverse set of stakeholders and maybe a public who's been over-researched, over-questioned, untrusted?
That's a great question, Alicia. And so I actually have a really good example. And so I can kind of want to use Lubbock, Texas as kind of a really good model in terms of how this community-based organization really built trust with one of the kind of most distressed neighborhoods in the city. And so what they did was, it was a kind of local church that wanted to start kind of a community-based organization that really focused on meeting the everyday needs of citizens within their neighborhoods. So everything from quality healthcare, food, clothing. And what they did for 3 years, they went around and knocked on every door and would have conversations with neighbors residents living in that neighborhood. And so they invested 3 years of their time to really get to know the people that were living in the community that they wanted to serve. And not to mention that they partnered with the local elementary school, and every Friday they would leave small gifts in the teachers' mailboxes as a way to encourage them. It's one of the kind of lowest performing schools in the neighborhood in the city overall. But this organization, community-based organization, really knew that it was really important to invest in the neighborhood, but really understood the importance of building relationships, right? And understand that relationships don't happen overnight. It really takes time. They invested 3 years, and after that, they received $1 million from our local foundations to invest in the work that they were doing, all because they took the time to really get to know the people that were living there. And so today they provide everything from prom dresses to seniors graduating, senior girls graduating from high school. They have a healthcare clinic. They just opened up a new domestic violence shelter. I mean, they're dealing with things like such as human trafficking. They're supporting initiatives that support a lot of healthcare initiatives, but also educational initiatives that really are working with kids who are underperforming. So they have literacy programs, right? And so they couldn't be successful until they built the trust with neighborhood residents first. And now this organization is not only able to leverage foundation dollars, but also local government dollars and state dollars, all because they took the time to build those relationships. And again, another organization too here in Lubbock, Texas, that focuses on homelessness. That's very controversial. A lot of downtown areas don't want shelters, right? Because they don't want their customers, right, consumers, walking over people. And but again, this homeless shelter spent, I think, 5 years in that neighborhood working to build the trust, not more so with the neighborhood residents, but also with the businesses who lived there or who were also there. And then, as a result, they were able to leverage, federal, state, and federal dollars to really address chronic homelessness in Lubbock, Texas. So I'd say the key thing is building relationships and realizing that it may take 3 or 5 years to get it done. But if you can show that you really care, you're really invested in the community, it'll be so easy to leverage outside dollars to really address some of those issues that are so prevalent in low to moderate income neighborhoods.
So Jen, on a local basis, what have we done so far? What collaborations are we trying? What's worked? And then what are areas where we haven't been as successful yet? And what are the plans for that?
So I think right away, when this first neighborhood was really identified as having challenging points, the city of Dekalb initiated a planning process, that neighborhood revitalization, neighborhood transformation process that would involve all of those stakeholders from the community, social service agencies, housing authority, everyone that was kind of serving but not connected necessarily, and then the residents as well. And a couple of things early on, a residents group formed from one particular housing group to really address an immediate opportunity in a change of ownership to address their needs. But on a broader level, there's a neighborhood revitalization called Opportunity Dekalb. And I can see a couple of their members and leaders are on here today as well. And they have really taken that charge of from inception to implementation, really to make sure that the wishes and the issues that the neighborhood addressed really are brought to light, and that's a long process, right? You have some immediate issues or some immediate fires that happen, but then there's long-term economic development and land issues. And so I think that has been what I have seen in a couple of neighborhood efforts that's really successful. But you're also seeing within that, social service agencies really are collaborating to talk about, here's what I'm doing, here's what we're doing, here's what we're seeing. The police department, working in there with the school district and saying, look, we do have some crime issues we've got to talk about and address. So I think you're seeing that come together. I think what we haven't been able to figure out just yet is this particular neighborhood is extremely transient. It is the largest rental housing units or home to the most amount of rental housing units in our community. And because we're a college community, that's a lot of units. And so some units are seeing, complexes are seeing as many as 80% turnover, right, every single year. So really engaging those residents, making them feel connected, and getting that involvement rather than just I just stay here. I'm just here for a little while. I'm just here for a little while. I think we've got work, all of us, to do in that regard as well. And then just managing, some of our residents are just going to be there for a short time because they're there for college, but others are finding their way here for a better way of life. And that's really hard to get them connected at times.
So Nate, something that we had talked about last week also is how do the issues around race overlay all of this neighborhood transformation, and we hear the words gentrification and kind of what does that mean? Because I think Jennifer, you can talk about the work that's certainly going on with the Belonging Council, but what do you see out there when it comes to this work and race?
So as we know, right, historically, right, because of redlining and other disinvestment, also construction of highways, right, placement of like power plants in low-income neighborhoods, dating back to the 1960s, 1950s. We do know that there has been a lack of this investment, also a lot of structural racism, systemic racism, in terms of how we do housing and economic development. And so I think realizing, especially from a government standpoint, even from a nonprofit standpoint, for those who are actually currently doing the work or developing programs, is really recognizing this history behind economic community development in our country, and realizing that it has been based primarily on race, right? And so I think kind of going in there and understanding that or having that mindset at least, I think will be really, really beneficial for those who are launching these grassroots initiatives to really create change within those communities. But also realizing too, so one of the things with community-based organizations or community development corporations is that they often, not to their own fault, really become like these capitalistic entities where they're coming in, they're investing, they're changing their neighborhoods, they're building coffee shops, they're rehabbing dilapidated housing. What happens is, as we want, right? Tax base goes, property values go up, right? Which is a great sign in any community, but we don't realize that the negative impact it has on individuals, primarily people of color, who often don't have the generational wealth compared to their white counterparts, right? And so who can't afford, the new taxes if they're fortunate to own their home, or can't afford the new rental prices, once the neighborhood beautifies. So I think it's really important that local government officials are really kind of attentive to that, right? And so I know a lot of cities, New York City, for example, I think under the Bloomberg administration, created like ceilings, right, on how much landlords could charge on rent in certain neighborhoods across the city. So that was very prominent in Harlem area of New York City. So I think gentrification, right, is kind of a two-edged sword, right? It's really good because you want your neighborhood to look good, but at the same time, we don't realize the negative impact it has on people who are actually living there, right? Who may not have the resources, right, to even go shop at the coffee shop, right, because there's one there. So I think it's really important for government officials to really think about how they can keep pricing low, at the same time ensuring that quality of life overall is improving for low-income individuals, also for people who want to live there and invest in that neighborhood.
So Jen, did you want to talk about the work that's going on simultaneously with Belonging, and how does that relate to this neighborhood transformation work?
Yeah, so maybe we'll get to that in just a second. I want to piggyback a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think Nate, I think we got to press harder on this one a little bit, because when we did this the other day, it was like, so I want to go back to that thing. Like, one of my experiences is that neighborhood transformation, like I said, it begins when somebody's dissatisfied, right? Somebody's dissatisfied with quality conditions, right? And I think sometimes in communities, if we're really honest, it's where did that dissatisfaction come from, sort of can point to maybe some of those issues. So if it's external to the neighborhood, right? If it's community members saying, look, that neighborhood is really Black and brown, it's full of a lot of crime, I don't like the way it looks, and sort of those people, right? It's ugly, terrible language, right? And when we don't involve the residents, right? We do not engage those that are living in the neighborhood in that conversation about transformation, right? About what's happening, but things that we're dissatisfied with, or that they as residents are, we're not even starting off, in my opinion, on the right foot, right? We're just saying, I don't like it there, and I want it to be different. And so that's when we can fall prey to gentrification, because we're like, look, I want the cute coffee shop. I want the cute little boho neighborhood. I want to turn that into, the market that's in that old warehouse, right? And I want to see all those apartments, and I want to see EAV go up. but that displaces people. And I think I want to press Nate a little bit on who gets involved early on in transformation and how we prevent that or how we enhance that process.
So that's a good point. So you mentioned something about, Jen, about kind of the Black and brown neighborhoods and high crime, high drugs, and often that's not the case.
Right.
And let's be honest. I think about, I can use some places in Texas, for example. There's this false stigma that crime and is really relevant or really prevalent rather in primarily African American neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, and that's not necessarily true. A lot of the crime, a lot of times, often are in all white working class neighborhoods. Often, times, in places like Texas. And I can't speak for every state, but a lot of times developers use that as a way to not invest in primarily African American neighborhoods that often were these thriving middle class neighborhoods in the 50s and 60s. So let's not get it wrong. I mean, oftentimes those neighborhoods are really are the problem, but it's just because a lot of times what we're finding now because of migration patterns, that a lot of the working class neighborhoods are kind of like these oases where people want to be closer to like downtown, want to be closer, especially when the local government starts to invest in their downtowns. And so oftentimes it's not necessarily gentrification in Black and brown neighborhoods. Oftentimes it's the lack of investment. And so I think that the question we're not answering is why, or I guess we're not addressing is why aren't local governments investing in Black and brown neighborhoods, especially those neighborhoods that once were thriving communities for African Americans that contain lawyers and dentists. I mean, there were one-stop shops for everything within that neighborhood, and often because a lot of African Americans, their kids want to go, live in the suburbs. They want the bigger houses, or they prefer to live out of state. They haven't really invested back into their communities. But oftentimes, local government also ignores those communities, and so I don't think it's an issue with gentrification, honestly, Jen. I think it's really the lack of government officials wanting to invest in those neighborhoods. And oftentimes that conversation is directed by city council, private developers, right, who come in and who are making the decisions or pressing local government officials or local mayors to say, hey, let's invest on this side. We don't really care about putting resources in these African American neighborhoods, right? Following the money, right?
Yep.
And so and especially as migration patterns push out to other parts of cities, and that's where population growth happens. Oftentimes that's where developers want to be at. So they're like, why would I put a supermarket or a plaza right in this neighborhood that's dying off, even though they have no crime, drugs is not an issue there, right? Their housing is older or dated, right? But I want to go where the growth is at, and I think that is what's happening right now is. Developers are kind of pushing local government officials to say, "Hey, let's work on this side of town versus this side of town." And so, I mean, they're gentrifying like open fields and cotton fields here in Texas and West Texas, right? People don't even live there, right? Where they could be investing right in these communities that have great infrastructure, right, and which are thriving communities that don't have any crime, any drug related issues. People not getting shot at 2:00 in the morning, right? But it's all because these are Black and brown neighborhoods, right? That they don't really care. And oftentimes they feel like they don't have the resources or money there to do. However, if we look at patterns, right? I used to be a city planner. When I looked at kind of how stores are performing, I mean, there's a lot of money within Black and brown neighborhoods, right? We forget that wealth is just not contained with white America, right? There's a lot of buying power in Hispanic communities, Latinx communities rather, and also in African American communities. So again, I don't think it's about a question about gentrification. I just think it's a lack of investment by local governments, right? They're following the money and they're allowing private developers, private interests to drive what they do as local governments.
I love how Nate, like we made this, we can bring in the national sides of this issue because like a neighborhood does not need to be transformed just because one day it woke up, right? And it was falling apart,
right?
Right. It attracts, right? When you lack an investment, we all know that broken windows theory, like if I stop investing in you, things are going to, negatively impact. And I think that on a, my lens is oftentimes very regional, right? And we look at like Chicago, and we have some serious issues where we do have, look, I don't want my neighborhood to be that. I want a red line. I want to keep all these pockets of homogeneity, and then I'm not going to invest over there, right? And so I think that that is a really, really like spot on. I'm so glad you're like, no, Jen, I don't agree with you on that. Right? To say, look, I think that it starts because we don't invest, right? Or more so, or not more so. In addition to, I think we get afraid. We get afraid when, wow, there's all this group here and I don't know what that means, right? And I don't know how to deal with that. And we're afraid when we see someone who's different from us. That's a natural human thing. And so in the work of belonging, right, it starts at a very core principle of you belong here. Like it's not a do you or don't you, right? It starts with the principle of you live here, or you go to school here, or you work here, right? You are here, you belong. And what that then means is you are part of defining, right? You are a decision maker in what happens here. And so you get to, it's not just like, oh, come sit at the lunch table. It's, should we even be sitting at a lunch table? Should we even like, and so it's really engaging all of the community in those conversations, right? And so that, like you said, on city councils, it's not just deciding, well, that neighborhood over there is thriving. Let's keep investing. Let's keep building. It's wait, we all belong here, and this neighborhood's starting to need a little bit of work, so let's invest and let's address fear, early on and say, this is thriving economics. We want all to thrive.
There we go. So since Nate's a planner, what are some tools that local government can use in the planning book to try to do some of this work? What are policies that are out there or tools that planners and economic development experts have at their disposal to do some of this work? And then Jen, you could comment on kind of what we've tried and what we're working on too.
Comprehensive planning. I think every neighborhood should ensure that they are a part of the comprehensive plan for that said city. I think one of the strengths of many cities that have been successful, right, ensuring that the most marginalized communities have a voice is through the comprehensive plan, where that often binds cities to ensure that, okay, our neighborhood is going to look like this. We're going to ensure over the next 5 years that our neighborhood gets these certain resources, or we get this new roadways or improved infrastructure, right? And a lot of that really comes through a plan where it brings together some of those prominent people in the city, but ensuring that every community's needs is represented in that plan. And so I think that's been a really good tool by cities across the country to ensure that some of the most marginalized communities, that their voices are heard. Right, as when I was a city planner, I always loved the fact that we had a comprehensive plan because, again, some of those communities that lacked investment, when people would come in, like a Walgreens or Walmart, they would say, hey, this is our comprehensive plan. This is what we want. This is how we want to preserve our neighborhood. And either you adhere to that or you can go build next, across the way. And so that was always, those were always fun meetings because it was always good to kind of present that to the developer. And they would be like, oh, wow, okay. But oftentimes what we would find is that they would adhere to that plan, right? Because they realized the buying power of that neighborhood, of that community, and they wanted to be there, but they had to adhere to what was in that comprehensive plan. So I think that's probably one of the best tools that can be used. I know there are a lot of other economic development tools. I mean, there are a lot of state and local funding mechanisms that also can be used by local governments to really improve upon the neighborhoods. And so I'm always a fan of, when I was a city planner in New York, we leveraged state funds through kind of like a housing first kind of, well, kind of like it was called Restore New York. And essentially what we did was we leveraged funds to really, we would go in and we identified some of the most dilapidated housing. And so we would sell the houses for $1 to teachers, to police officers, to middle class citizens, local government officials, to also to come in and buy the house for $1, and we would provide them with a grant to rehab the house, and they were not allowed to rent the house. They had to live in the house, I think, from like 5 to 10 years before they could sell it. But they had to commit to that neighborhood, right? And so that was a plan that really was very successful in upstate New York, right? So that's another policy tool that can be used by local government at every level, right? To really kind of work in improving some of the most distressed communities across our country.
So
Yeah,
Jen,
so-
things that we have tried here.
Yeah, so first of all, I love that thinking about the comp plan down to the neighborhood level, right? Because I think sometimes like, I know there's a lot of public admin folks on here, the folks at R1 are here, right? So sometimes we look at regional, comp plans, but looking at that municipal comp plan down to the neighborhood level, and then involving and sort of that's like, you're like, this is our roadmap, right? This is where we want to go. These are where our standards are. Because sometimes I feel like we have these community revitalization plans, right? And they're kind of over here on the shelf. We talk about them, right? And then here's the comp plan. But having that engaged, I think that's really important. We have used all of those tools. We also have tax increment finance district. So we have that one in our downtown, our central business district, which is to address blight, and really that has been a prominent tool. That's an Illinois, a tool we love here, right? But also I see Joanne Rouse is here from the city of Dekalb, our CDBG funds and what we do with our CDBG planning, right? That community development block grant planning, and then really being able to intertwine some of those tools. But I also like when we see our health system, we have Northwestern Medicine, right? And they do that 3-year indicator planning, right? And that starts to tell us, because they're at a community level for that planning, right? And so is our health department. Both agencies do that intertwining that and looking at that and seeing like, wow, we're really missing, there's some important metrics that the community is talking about. Maybe it's on health or on housing, that gives us information, really back into that core community development planning. We in Dekalb, in the Annie Glidden neighborhood, it's also an opportunity zone. So it is because of the blight. There's some state level entities that are involved in that, as well as enterprise zoning. That's giving some incentives for whether it's a homeowner or a business or development to happen. It's encouraging that because there's risk, right? So when you have that neighborhood that's a food desert, and you don't have that grocery store yet, but those residents that want and need some of those tools can be really helpful in aiding that encouragement to happen there as well.
So I know, Nate, you touched on it already. You can go ahead and comment to Jen's, and then we can go on to
So I would say, so I'm not a huge fan of opportunity zones or promise zones or traditionally enterprise zones, right? And it's it's an old concept that was, as many of you may know on the call already, that was adopted by Republicans. It's been I kind of label it as a kind of a bipartisan failure, and the hope that these enterprise zones would often create jobs, right? And so oftentimes from a research standpoint, we have not seen that. And so it may be different in DeKalb County compared to other places across the country, but oftentimes we find that private developers often are the ones who benefit from these promise zones, something that was instituted under the Obama administration, and then now opportunity zones was under the Trump administration. And so I'm always a little cautious with those because data is really mixed in terms of how well they've helped some of the most distressed neighborhoods across our country. So I'm always a proponent of really advocating for community-based organizations as kind of like a policy tool that can be used to improve local communities across our country. And so oftentimes those economic incentives really are not felt by some of the most marginalized people living in these communities. And so I'm really kind of not sold on the fact that these enterprise zones or opportunity zones actually do what they're said that they're supposed to be doing in those local communities.
Yeah, I think we're early on though, Nate. So I love it because it's a warning signal like, hey, hold on. I think there's some components I've already seen where it has the potential, right? Where you've got a good section of land that's totally blighted. Nothing's there. It's an eyesore. It's falling apart. And so then you take that and you take what that neighborhood study, right? And that what the community input said, hey, look, we really would like to see a community center, right? We'd like to see a grocery store. We'd like to see these things. And then if you can use those incentives, right? You use that tool to leverage implementation of what the community has said, boy, we really need these things in our neighborhood. And I've seen Opportunity Dekalb, that's the neighborhood organization there, be very committed to that, very committed to using those tools. But we're early on in this, and so that's not to say that, boy, we really do need to be mindful of that. But we also, in our area, Alicia, we've got the Dekalb County Community Gardens. It's a cooperative of local gardens, and it's a food hub, and they're getting ready to build a pretty substantial food hub right in adjacent into the neighborhood to meet some of those immediate needs. And that's all part of that local community organizations kind of coming together and saying, how do we leverage resources and needs? In addition to, we haven't talked about this, the role faith-based organizations play. And we have seen, especially in this particular neighborhood, a couple of faith-based organizations that are anchors in the neighborhood, providing that community center, providing those meals, that gathering space that's really been integral.
Yeah, I like Nate's example from earlier, the church that you said got heavily involved. We certainly have some of that movement here regionally. In terms of the research, Nate, is there anything else where, you know, something has showed up in the research that we know works but hasn't really made it into practice? Or we really haven't researched this area to see how do these levers interact with each other?
We do. So a lot of my research really argues, right, that we really need to focus more on the community-based development model, right? So focusing on organizations, traditionally have, you know, we refer to them as community development corporations that were created as a result of the war on poverty legislation under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. And so I spent a lot of time researching the impact that these organizations have locally, right? And so again, they're only one piece of the puzzle. So I'm not saying that they're like the answer to every economic issue, community development issue within these neighborhoods, but they definitely are one of the driving forces for creating change at the local level. And so really it's important and there's been a lot of disinvestment starting from the Reagan administration. But if federal government would really invest more in community development organizations who have a proven track record in improving some of the most distressed neighborhoods in our country, I think we would start to see a lot of movement. And again, I know Jen has mentioned kind of the opportunity zones, and there's been some success. However, we do know those traditional economic tools, economic development tools, really haven't worked, right, to change some of the most marginalized communities. And we often find, like, kind of going to like that faith-based organization, all right, that often has a trust. I think relying on those organizations, right, to be drivers of that change, I think is probably something to argue for in a lot of research that I do, and really working on and kind of increasing their capacity. What we're finding, I find in my research is that those organizations that have the capacity to do it are successful, right? I mean, there are also a lot of organizational contingencies that we have to think about too as well in terms of the environment in which they operate in. But we do know that government funding is definitely a huge driver of their success, right? And so really investing in these community-based organizations, I think is one small answer, right, to addressing this change. Again, I mean, there are other factors, right, that we need to consider though. But I mean, I will argue to the end of time that community development organizations are definitely a tool that should be used more often.
I agree with you, Nate. We just had a poverty listening session. The state of Illinois has a commission on poverty elimination. We can ignore the elimination's a really important word, but big, and you know, let's get to the facts. But we just did this, and a couple of the folks that are on here today were part of that, and the purpose of that was to really give the state some feedback on policies that we needed to see at the local level to address these issues. And I think you're really underscoring a point that was made there, which was at the local level, we really do know what folks need, and putting some trust, right? And then being able to increase capacity within those local organizations and those local non-for-profits. It's sort of, we know what they need, or right, because we're there, we're working, we're right, we are each other, right, in that. And so having those dollars trickle down, and not just trickle down to them, but some of the policies there that they're sort of pinholed into, right? Like if you make this much money, you're going to lose your housing benefits, or if you go to school, you're going to lose this, right? It was it's a disincentive for families in some case, and all these local agencies are like, and these local non-for-profits are like, if they would trust us, like we really do know what we want to do, and increasing the capacity within those organizations. We have a number of emerging non-for-profits in our belonging center, right? And there's that ability right there to really folks that are from this community and neighborhoods and saying like, look, we want to be enhanced and able to deliver the services we know folks need.
I want to be able to leave a little bit of time for questions. So Cameron, if you want to unmute and ask your question, then I'll go to Marjorie.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Shadman. This has been a great convo, and I really appreciate, both of our experts, everybody here. I have a question on trust, and from my point of view, that has been kind of the through line through a lot of this conversation is, right, like how do we achieve trust, and then how do we do so within like all of the policy initiatives and all the constructs in which we have to navigate every day. And I'm curious from the experts, have you found examples of, or have you yourself found metrics of trust or things that can be held as proxy for achieving trust? I ask because in the work that I do in facilitating pro bono work, right, like that's often one of the things that we speak to as an outcome, but often can't prove it. And in a world where we idolize and metrics and the ability to count things, I'm just curious, have you found any successes in doing that?
I'm going to defer to Nate first, because Cameron, you're so kind, expert. Dr. Wright is the expert. I've just gotten to be part of doing some of the work.
And that, so in terms, so I have not, so in my work, there are, there's certainly like survey items I can send you. But honestly, what it really boils down, just from a qualitative standpoint, Cameron, is I think the trust thing, and I know, I mean, to me, I would say probably more so like case studies versus like quantitative indicators. I mean, trust is really difficult to operationalize. And so I would say looking at more so like best practices or examples, right, in terms of organizations that have done this successfully. What I can tell you from experience is I think oftentimes is that white counterparts, for example, have this white savior complex and kind of going in there. And their intentions may be really good, but oftentimes if they don't know what it's like to grow up poor in a marginalized community, oftentimes that's a huge disconnect. And so, even for now, I think we were talking about this the other day, Jen, about the fact that even me, I have a certain level of privilege now, right? And so I'm so far removed from what it was like growing up in a poor neighborhood that going in would be really difficult for me because, I shop at Whole Foods right now, right? I mean, there's certain things that I do, right? That I really couldn't relate to your average American now, right? And so, but I think it's really important to have, this is why it's so important to have individuals that live in that community to be a part of the process from day one, right? And having them is, I mean, there's no reason why I should be the voice, right? We can train these individuals, right, to do the work that we're doing, right? We can train them to go and run focus groups with us. We can go and have them run surveys and help us collect data. But we can't go to them after we develop, even from a survey standpoint, right? If I'm developing interview questions or survey questions, I may not know the lingo now, right? It's really important to have them, even when we're constructing these instruments, talk to people who are living there, right? So I think that's often the mistake that we make as researchers, is that we go to these individuals after we get the money and after we develop the research questions, interview questions, after we kind of develop the research protocol, and we haven't included the people who are most impacted in those marginalized communities to be a part of the process from day one. So, right, so I think that's kind of the key. And even as academics, right? I mean, I don't care, if you're from that neighborhood, even being a PhD student, right, or being somebody who grew up in a neighborhood, oftentimes there's a huge disconnect, even with that. And so it's really important that we're talking to people that live there and making sure that they are a part of the process every step of the way.
Yeah, I was just I think Shelley puts a great comment in there, right? It's I have seen the trust be built when you are consistent, when you're authentic, right? Yeah. When you do what you say you're going to do, right? And Nate's like 100% because he's the expert, right? That it's the engagement and involvement of those who live there, those who are impacted by this, those who are walking those, streets every single day. It's that voice that matters. And we often talk about who are your trusted gatekeepers, right? Who are those people, right? And the reason they are there is because they're there, they live there. So I found working with trusted gatekeepers to inform me, right? And then to identify folks that are like, hey, look, how do we help you, right, be able to do this in your neighborhood, right, in your way, and listen to your voice and develop your dialogue and your story here. And so I think that's the big thing. And I really want to think about what are metrics for trust. Dr. Brian Richard is on here from NIU Center for Governmental Studies. And I'm going to be like, what? So Cameron, I love that. I really want to think about it. I don't have an answer for metrics for trust. But when Nate and I were talking the other day, I said, hope is a dangerous currency. This is something, and I know he doesn't, but like when you go in and you say, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this, right? And folks are in survival mode, right? And you do that, you've created like, okay, you're coming in, right? And that somebody wrote on here that savior complex, or no, Nate said that white savior complex. It could even be like city development savior complex, right? Coming in here as if it needs to be saved. But now you've put some hope, like, oh, you're going to build me a park. Oh, you're going to bring in transportation. Oh, you're going to do all of these things. And it's only begun, right? And we don't have all of those tools and things there. So I think it's being conscientious of the process and understanding and learning to listen a whole lot.
Yeah. I also want to address before, I know we have like 8 minutes left though. So I know we wanted to kind of talk about trust too some more, but Marjorie had a really good point or question in here in terms of kind of like, does this translate to—
And Marjorie, did you want to ask your question? You can unmute if you want to ask your question.
Yeah.
You're still muted. If you want, you can just go up.
Yeah, no, I agree with all this because I can see how we could go into that neighborhood with all our education and preconceived ideas of what's good for you. And like I put down, if you come in with a degree as a decorator and start telling me how I should decorate my house without asking or hearing me, I think, and I think listing everything that you know and your degree before you talk to them starts the shutdown. I am here to help you. But, and how do we balance that? We're going to bring wonderful economic development with quality of life. And also, does this translate to rural America? And I think that's just a statement on what's going on in the country. Just because you're educated, you may have the education, but I have the experience. And how does all that work? It's just, I'm an advocate for transportation in the 5-county area. They have the money, they've got the buses, but the execution is so poor and people are becoming resentful. But when I bring it up to them, I have to dispel all their theories because they don't even ride a bus. And then say, now can we look at this problem? Thank you for what you've given us, but your execution is poor.
Thank you, Marjorie.
So I wanted to touch on the rural piece, Marjorie, and the issues that are prevalent in urban communities are no different than in rural communities. And so oftentimes I think we think there's a difference. It really isn't. Poverty is prevalent in rural America. Access to healthcare, right, is something that's prevalent in rural communities across the country. And I think that's something that we forgot about as a nation. And also too, I always say that rural communities are the lifeline for urban communities, right? You think about where cows are at, right? I mean, the fact that we have milk, I mean, we don't, things like that, we don't really think about when we're living in urban communities, but the fact that a lot of what rural spaces do in terms of farming and ranching really are so important to urban communities, right? That enjoy everyday pleasures and going to restaurants or shopping. Keeping in mind that cotton, for example, is prevalent in a lot of rural communities across the country, and everything we do, and the clothes that we wear, right? And so I think realizing that there really isn't a difference, right? I mean, there's issues with broadband access, right, in rural communities that we don't talk enough about, right? Quality of education is just as important in rural communities as it is in urban communities. And really, I'm hoping that we'll get past this rural-urban divide as a country, because I think that's what we're seeing kind of in our politics, that really rural America really hasn't been heard for a long time, and realizing that their issues are no different than if you're in Chicago, right? Or if you're in Indianapolis. Now also too, I agree with your first comment too, Marjorie, you know, it's like also having my mom come in and tell my wife how to redecorate our house. That's like, right? I mean, that's like maybe World War III, right? And so, no, I think you make a really important point. I think it's a tough balancing act, because I think oftentimes people who have the expertise, who are educated, are so excited because they really want to create change, right? But when they're leading off with the fact that I went to University of Chicago, I went to Northern Illinois, right, or University of Illinois Chicago, right? They're proud of that because they want you to know that they're the experts and they're here to help. But maybe kind of going in there saying, hey, you know, we realize that we may not be the experts. We want to get to know who you are, and then maybe kind of later on kind of talk about, okay, here's what we can do from you, from basically our educational training and what we've learned in our careers. So
yeah, Nate, I think you said it, like, we're not the experts on your neighborhood. Right. Yeah. We're not. Like, I might be an expert on what policy is said or what literature says, but I'm not an expert on what your life is. And so Nate, NIU is located in rural America.
Yeah,
right. It's defined. We're defined as rural America.
Yeah,
and then our county is made up of it's a really, really spread out county. And so I think the folks that are on here regionally, Rockford can identify this. What Freeport is different. What was Rockford's facing. Winnebago is different from what Belvedere is facing. But those core issues are the same, right? Of access, right? Of access to those core fundamental things that make up. I think sometimes rural America, in my experience, just because I've lived here most of my life, is that it is just more spread out, right? It's not as talked about, like, oh, I don't know how to get to there, right? But that's the same as in an inner city too, like getting to there, it's just a different way of looking at that definition. And then employment and access, again, all of those same things. I know we've got more questions, so I'll be quiet so we can, in 3 minutes. And I'm so glad, Brian, you turned your camera on, because you would be also one of like the experts, not me.
Shiraz has a question that he put into the comments. So Shiraz, do you want to unmute and ask it, or we can just go off the question in the comments? Up to you.
You can just go off that.
Okay.
It's like when you're just starting, we're involved in starting a social enterprise in a neighborhood that feels like could have some new life breathed into it, but really this conversation is so helpful. And I think we do want to form these relationships, but wondering where to start.
Shiraz, can I ask you a question? Who is we? In your particular case, who is we? Are you a municipality? Are you a community group?
We are just a community volunteer group looking to breathe some new life into the old Just Good space in Rockford, in Midtown, through a social enterprise that involves a store and a programming space, but really wanting to hear from folks in the community what they would like to have happen there.
I mean, I'll just start, and I'm sure Nate has got, numerous examples, but for me, it starts again with who are the gatekeepers, if you know that, like who are the people who are trusted, right, in that, who have been there for quite a while, right, or who folks in that particular area may trust, who have been invested for a long time, so that I can learn, right, because again, right. I'm not an expert by any means, and there's probably a whole lot of dynamics and years of stories of things that have been happening, and then it's sitting down and listening, right? There's every voice belongs and matters and has a piece of the story to tell. And so, some people say that, you kind of leapfrog through the conversations, but, I have found that it takes a little while to sometimes find it. I know my good friend on here, Rose Henton, is on here as well. Like, sometimes you got to be like, who's the person I should talk to? Like, who's right. the person, and then listening and being guided by them. Sure. Nate, I'm curious to know in all your experiences.
So I'm very familiar with the kind of the social entrepreneurship model, and I know a lot of community development is kind of adopting some of those practices, right, to be more innovative in how we address some of the issues facing marginalized communities. So I think the important piece would be, I think, going into any community is, the first question is, well, what's a social entrepreneurship, right? And what does that look like? Keeping in mind it has more of a more business-like model, with more of a hybrid type of like nonprofit, right? So I think kind of explaining kind of how that operates, and realizing, one of the cool things about social entrepreneurships, that it provides more flexibility, right, to organizations from a tax perspective, but also just allows them to be a lot more innovative in terms of what they can do to transform neighborhoods. And so I think really building trust is no different than it would be for a 501c3 or a 501c4 or a 501c6, right? So I think that kind of going in there and really kind of not only educating people on what a social entrepreneurship model looks like, but also, spending time to get to know the key stakeholders, or as Jen said, the gatekeepers for that community. I don't think it's any different if you look at it through a social entrepreneurship lens, or even through a community development model lens.
Thank you very much for the question, Shiraz. I appreciate it. Awesome. Well, it's 1:01. I know people have many things to do. I want to thank both of our presenters, Jennifer and Nate, today for sharing their expertise, their background, their research. Please reach out to them, connect with them on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Connect with us. On behalf of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies, I'm glad that you spent your lunch hour with us. Next month is on international NGOs, and we're partnering with the Simmons Center in Chicago. They're home to over 40 different international nonprofits that are based in Chicago. And so we'll have a good conversation around that. So have a great afternoon, everybody. And I'll send out the recording link so you can share with whoever you'd like to share it with. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nate. You're amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia.
Thanks so much.
You're so welcome.